where we will discuss the transition of technologies to the market and ultimately to the clinic. This panel will be led by Dr. Michael Vincent, Senior Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer of the Inflammation and Immunology Research Unit at Pfizer. Other roles include clinical head for pharma therapeutics at Pfizer and medical sciences executive director at Amgen. He will give a very short introduction to the topic and then introduce our other speakers.
Great, thank you. It sounds like my mic is on and working. Hopefully everyone else has remembered to turn theirs on. Well, welcome to the panel. As the title implies, we're going to talk about the journey of an idea or a basic technology discovery in the laboratory all the way to a product. And at least in my mind, I think of that process as commercialization. Just by way of introduction to the panel, I thought since that's the heart of the topic, I'd begin by asking each of the panelists to talk about what their preferred method is of getting from that state of an idea all the way to a marketplace. And that way they can each introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what their perspective is on the commercialization process. And I'll start from left to right here with Kate.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Zhang. I'm coming from Editas Medicine. And so my previous experience is working with Genzyme and Sanofi. So my path from research to commercialization really 2 stages. I think at Genzyme, that was the leading company to bring the enzyme replacement therapy for rare disease, open up the a vast market for the rare disease. And in Editas, which I joined last year, and certainly bring gene editing, both in vivo editing and ex vivo cell therapy, gene editing cell therapy. That's another way to bring to the market. So I'm sure following the conversation, there's many discussions, but I think I certainly not participated in the funding, but I certainly contribute to bring the science to the market. So I leave the funding for my next speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Bitterman. I'm a partner with Atlas Venture. Been at Atlas for a couple of years. Before that, I was with another Boston-based firm called Polaris for about 12 years. I've made it a point in my career only to work at firms that were smart enough to invest in Alnylam. So it's been a good, it's been a good rule to live by. So my strong bias, my entirety of my last 15 years has been spent around startups. Starting out of grad school, was part of a company that came out of my graduate lab. Was fortunate at Polaris to work with a lot of great entrepreneurs around a lot of great technologies, and am now at Atlas doing only that. So Atlas is a firm, we can talk more about it, but it is purpose-built to find great science, incubate that science, gather exceptional entrepreneurs to nucleate and then launch and scale what we hope are transformational companies, all focused on therapeutics development across therapeutic areas and across drug modalities. So happy to talk more about that.
I'm Kirsten Benjamin. I'm a vice president of biology at Amyris. I've been there for 12 years, and Amyris was founded about 15 years ago, spun out from a chemical engineering lab at UC Berkeley. So I'm most familiar with technologies that were taken from academia into the marketplace that are spun out of academic labs. And I've seen Amyris go through a lot of transformations over the past 12 years. Also, my expertise is going to complement the expertise of the other 3 people that we heard from, in that Amyris is not in the therapeutic space. If you look at US biotechnology revenues, they're roughly 1/3 therapeutics, 1/3 agriculture, and 1/3 industrial biotechnology. And Amyris is an industrial biotechnology company. What we do is engineer microbes to convert sugar into virtually anything we want them to make. And then we take those highly engineered microbes and ferment them in large stainless steel fermenters that range from 50,000 to 200,000 liters in size. And we then recover the product from the fermentation broth and either sell that directly as a product or use that as a chemical feedstock for chemical synthesis that then creates the product.
So John Maraganore, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. Alnylam is a 17-year-old company that has been involved in pioneering RNAi therapeutics as a new class of medicines. I was the starting CEO of the company and been with it from the beginning all the way to where we are right now, which is really at an exciting point because we've launched our first drug after all this effort, and happy to talk more about that and our journey that we've had at our company.
So maybe as the token big pharma guy, one thing I can say about the commercialization process is that a lot of the work in our laboratories starts with reading papers that we see coming out of academic laboratories, trying to confirm whether we can reproduce those results in our own hands, judging whether the merit of the idea merits or warrants the investment that our precious time can be devoted to. And then we have all the wonderful things out in the world that we can shop and buy from either startups or small companies. So there's really a range that we deal with. Oftentimes, though, getting to the actual laboratory itself is not an easy thing. And I wonder if maybe, Kevin, you can talk a little bit about how you evaluate opportunities that you see come, because I imagine much of your job has to do with judging what are the best ideas to put more capital into.
Yeah, for sure. So the substrate that all of our companies start around is great science. So we look in all the usual places for great science. We've got our nose in the journals. We form relationships with academic institutions and PIs, and we do an incredibly rigorous vetting of that science. And so there's sort of an equal both inbound and sort of outbound effort to our company creation process. A lot of it is we're sent opportunities either directly to the investment team or through our broader network of entrepreneurs that we work with. We're fortunate to have about 36 entrepreneurs that actually cohabitate with us in our offices, in our incubator, and that's an incredibly powerful amplification of our network. So a lot of referrals come through them. But what we spend a lot of time doing is we get interested in an area, and we try to become really, really smart about that area. We talk to every PI, every KOL, and we sort of meander our way, mostly down blind alleys, but you learn a lot when you're going down a blind alley. And then you kind of back out and you sort of peel the onion, so to speak, and you're getting smarter. And when you finally find that one opportunity, you sort of have that aha moment of I've looked at 24 different things in this space and haven't got excited for reasons X, Y, or Z. And this is one that I'm willing to actually take a bet on. And people then vote with their feet at that point. You're going to need to marry the technology with, again, exceptional entrepreneurs. And so finding someone that can nucleate a team and an effort to, often it starts with repeating the data. If we're fortunate, we can build a relationship with a PI and learn about a lot of data that hasn't even been published yet, and that starts to form the basis of a company. But I think a lot of it comes from that pattern recognition of doing a very comprehensive deep dive in an area so that you can kind of differentiate the signal from the noise, and you sort of know the right one when you see it.
John, as a CEO, I'm sure you're seeing opportunities all the time that you can expand your areas of expertise. How do you think about it from the top of a mid-sized company?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's really about portfolio management and what programs do we invest in. Probably not unlike what you do at Pfizer, to think about what targets you want to pursue, what programs, indications you want to pursue. So it really is around building. We're staying obviously very committed to RNAi therapeutics. That's what we think we do best. There's a lot of opportunities to build from that overall, and building our pipeline is the key focus. We put about 2 to 3 new products into the clinic a year, and have got a pipeline that's matured to a double-digit number of programs in clinical development. So we're very much investing, allocating capital between discovery, development, commercial activities as a company. Probably not too different than what you guys do at a much bigger scale.
Yeah.
But it's pretty similar.
Yeah. Maybe we can switch tacks a little bit and talk about the regulatory environment, which I guess over my 16 years, I've seen change quite a bit from what I would characterize as predominantly an adversarial mindset to one that's, I would say, more collaborative in the last several years. But I wonder, Kate, from your perspective, with a completely new therapeutic modality, how do you guys think about the regulatory environment and whether whether regulators are ready for gene editing type technologies to cross their desks as therapeutics.
Well, the good news is our IND application got approved in 30 days without any data. So that certainly is a success. But I would agree with you that interaction is it's the theme of today's regulatory agency. So during my career working in Genzyme and Sanofi, I certainly walked that path many times looking at recombinant enzymes. And that really before the days of biosimilar, right? So now if you look at biosimilar market today, the regulatory agency has changed their view quite dramatically, right? So, but at the end of the day, it is evidence-based review process. So either it's known enzyme or antibodies or novel modality for RNA or ASO or even the gene editing, I think is still coming back to the sponsors to really think about the package you put together. You really have to be able to demonstrate safety and efficacy with a strong data package. But again, even for data package, what package Pfizer can submit and the data package editor submit is different, right? So there's always what's the core of that information. You know, how can you demonstrate with the key information there to persuade agency that there is risk benefit for the patient, and yet you have a rigorous foundation to demonstrate the path from the tox study going to clinic. So again, early interaction with regulatory agency, and understand your mechanism of action, and really prepare a solid foundation for the regulatory path forward.
I think we all maybe think about the FDA when we think of regulators and EMEA.
Right.
But for those of us who don't make therapeutics, I'm sure there are a lot of regulatory considerations in bringing a new technology forward. I wonder if, Kirsten, you could share with us some of the regulatory considerations in your field.
Yeah. So much of the regulatory that we're subject to, because essentially we're doing biomanufacturing. We're using biology to manufacture chemicals. So a lot of the same regulatory considerations come into play for us that come into play for older ways of making chemicals, either by mining or extracting or through chemical synthesis using primarily petroleum feedstocks. And so an important consideration for us is what is the purity of the product, what are the impurities, is the product that we're making similar to what's been made before, or do we need a separate filing for this chemical because the impurities are different? If the impurities are novel, what do we know about them and their safety profile and things like that. Of course, we are using genetically modified organisms to manufacture things, and the regulatory landscape there is rather complex, and it varies in different countries around the world. But the attitude of the US government, which has recently been reinforced, is that it doesn't matter so much how you make something as what's in the final product. And so whether you make it using genetically modified organisms, essentially as what's sometimes called a processing aid, because we take our microbes, let's say Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that instead of making bread and beer and wine, now we have it make the precursor for an anti-malarial drug or a biofuel or an ingredient in face moisturizers. The important thing is what's in the product at the end and not how was it made. And the products that we make, they don't have any genetically modified organisms. They don't have the cells in them. They don't have any DNA. They don't have any protein. They're highly purified chemicals. And so in some cases, in most cases actually, the fact that genetically modified organisms were used to make them is of no consequence.
Great, thanks.
Just, Mike, on this question, as it relates to at least, pharmaceutical products, I think it's fair to say that the regulatory environment has never been better than we are experiencing right now. I mean, I just got off a 2-year stint as chair of Biotech Innovation Organization, and spent a lot of time working with the regulatory authorities on PDUFA reauthorizations and 21st century cures and FIDASIA before that. And it's amazing. I mean, it goes back really to the start of Peggy Hamburg's leadership at FDA. And I think it was, sort of exemplified by Scott's leadership at FDA. But, you've got an agency that is really committed to bringing innovative medicines to patients as quickly as possible. And very, very different than what we experienced, 15, 20 years ago, where there was a very risk-adverse agency that was coming off the Avandia and Vioxx type of issue. So it's great to see it.
No,
John, do you worry? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm not able to ask questions. Do you worry at all about the post-Gottlieb era?
No, I think Sharpless is fundamentally aligned, with where Scott wanted to take it. And again, the things that happened under Scott, and he deserves a lot of credit, I'm not trying to diminish what he did, really started well before he got to that role. 21st Century Cures was not on his watch, for example. So these are organic changes. Now, if we have another Vioxx or Avandia or whatever, if whoever the new leader is, now Sharpless, and then future leaders, will they have the ability, like Scott, to provide resolve and appropriate handling of the matter from an FDA perspective? We'll have to see. Hard to predict.
Yeah.
But I think we've got an FDA that now is reconfigured in a way that will work for patients and work for public health and work with industry as part of that mission at the end.
Yeah. I guess my assessment would be the precursor to all the regulatory changes was actually the shift in the payer environment that really started to demand value. So when you're working on drugs for patients with fatal diseases, where the risk benefit is different than mass market diseases, where one very rare event in a product that's going to be seen by millions of people can really lead to egg on regulators' face pretty quickly. So it's the overall, I think, environment that we're making medicines more for value now than for a me too or a me slightly better. That's just not rewarded in the marketplace in the same way it has been, and I think regulators have moved in step with that.
Yeah.
From a funding perspective, how do we get the money to move these new technologies forward?
Just ask Kevin. He doles it out.
Maybe just to begin with, people probably think of Pfizer as a company where you don't have to
We asked
just
you.
reach in the back of the chair and pull out money to move things along. In fact, we have to dance for our dinner just like everyone else does, and part of that is, I think, understanding some of the terminology, some of the lingo, some of the valuation methodologies that I've had to become much more familiar with than I used to be when I was either seeing patients or working in a lab. I'm sure you do the same. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you assess, what kind of funding does a particular opportunity need, and how do you justify that funding?
Sure. I mean, as a sort of a macro comment, it's an interesting moment in time, and has actually been sort of an interesting extended moment in time where capital is not limiting for our industry.
Yeah.
And you can make an argument, we could sit here all day and debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. For much of the first 10 years I was in this business, capital was incredibly limiting. And many companies died, many investors kind of ran for the hills. And what you do note is some of the best companies come out of those times of starvation, sort of a nice Darwinism, and Alnylam was started and grew up in some very turbulent times. Capital is incredibly abundant right now. There's 5 biotechs going public in the next 48 hours, and they're going to do well. So for us, it's not about, we don't differentiate ourselves by having the biggest checkbook or having the most capital. It's almost commoditized at this point. Now that's not going to last forever, and that's a separate conversation. But in today's environment, we need to differentiate ourselves based on everything else but the capital. So we, think of ourselves less as investors, more as company builders, partners to the entrepreneurs that are going to be building the companies. So to answer your question is, how do we think about actually financing these? One of the things I really liked about Atlas when I was on the outside looking in is that there isn't necessarily a boilerplate model that we sort of go out and try to fund things towards. A lot of firms out there will do only sort of big build platform, product engine, new modalities. A lot of firms will gravitate more towards single asset type of opportunities that can be more virtual and capital efficient. There's certainly pros and cons to both of those. The way we look at the world is, again, it just goes back to finding great science, making sure there's an unmet need at the other end that you can address, and then sort of in each case, bespoke, build the right financing model, the right partnering strategy, the right long-term business model for that opportunity. And that may be a single asset where we can have 2 to 3 people working out of our offices, managing a bunch of virtual FTEs externally, and you can take something from de novo company creation into clinical development with a very small team. That may be the next gene editing or RNAi platform where you need to build a lot of infrastructure and capabilities, and you need to build a bigger syndicate. You need to think it'll be a more capital-intensive path. You maybe need to rely on partnering more. So this flexibility to sort of have the business model fit the opportunity rather than vice versa is something that we try to embrace, and we have a portfolio that does span the spectrum from virtual companies that are 4 or 5 people running clinical trials to very large next generation technologies where you're quickly ramping up to a couple hundred employees.
Any advice you'd give to entrepreneurs out there who have great ideas in terms of how to match their idea to a funding mechanism?
Yeah, I think so that's, you can easily speak in extremes of if I've got a single small molecule and I need to do some med chem to get to a development candidate, that's a pretty straightforward path, and there's a lot of resources, and it's very easy to have 30 chemists working for you externally in a very capital efficient manner. You don't need to build a lot of infrastructure in that, so that's easy. And you sort of know when you have a CRISPR-Cas9 in your hand that that's not something you're going to do with 3 people sitting virtually in an office. There's obviously a lot of shades of gray in between, and so the vast majority of companies do sit in between that spectrum, and there's a hybrid model where you're building some expertise and capabilities internally. You need to make the decision early on, what do I need to own? What is it not okay to have Evotech in Europe or WuXi in China trying to do for me? In this day and age, a lot of time that's more the biology that you want to own, and the chemistry can be outsourced a little bit more easily. That's a little oversimplified, but you'll see a lot of companies do that. And if there's a secret sauce to your platform, you need to own that technology. You need to build the expertise and the capabilities in-house, and so it's finding what that right balance is.
John, any thoughts about?
Well, I agree with everything Kevin said. Obviously we've actually cumulatively raised $5.3 billion since inception, invested $3 billion. Okay, so it just gives you a sense of the capital intensity of the business. And we're still investing about $1 billion a year at this point, right? So it is an incredibly capital-intensive business. We now have product revenues, which is terrific, because that's going to ultimately get us to a sustainable, profitable, ultimately model, which is good. So we don't have to rely on equity as a way of selling or raising money or whatever the case might be. But I think that there's no doubt that you have to go into this as an entrepreneur with the perspective that whether it's that small idea or that bigger idea, yes, the range of capital needs are going to be different, but they're still big needs, right? Any way you look at it. And then you have to think a little bit about, how do you time your capital raising consistent with where the value is being built, and also, consistent with where you don't leave yourself vulnerable to the dark days that happened. When the Great Recession hit in 9/10, we happened to have a balance sheet that allowed us to stay the course and not feel like we had to, shut down major parts of the business. That was just luck. It wasn't like we knew that, couldn't have known that. But you have to be able to be prepared to make sure your balance sheet is strong enough to weather the storms, whether it's external factors or whether the outside world no longer believes in what you're doing, which we've experienced, where you need to have the capital that allows you to generate the next set of data to then hopefully convince the skeptics that you can actually make it happen.
The last topic I think we wanted to touch upon was collaboration. And that's something we do quite a bit of in big pharma. In fact, one thing I would say is our leadership recognizes that left to our own devices, we're more likely to focus on our own, what's on our benchtop. So we have incentives in place so that we form partnerships with academics, that we do deals with small companies to try to collaborate on technologies that, if we wanted to go all in on, it would consume a lot of our resources, but we can access it with smaller companies. So I'm wondering, from maybe a small company perspective, how do you think about, you've got a hot new technology, I'm sure many big pharma companies are very interested in working in this area. How do you think about collaboration in that setting?
It's absolutely the key. I think, since I've been on both sides, when I was at Sanofi, I remember looking at the percentage of internal innovation versus external. I think at one point, probably around 2015, we got more external innovation coming in than internal innovation. I think at the time, our CEO was like, in 3 years, we tried to reverse that ratio, right? So we tried to building more internal innovation. But at the end of the day, I still think there's a significant enough research project in big pharma like Sanofi coming from external innovation. Yeah. And I think from editor's perspective, and I think because this is a platform company, and we cannot cover all the indication, but this platform can be used in many indications abroad. So we don't have the resources and bandwidth and the funding to do everything. So really strategically select our partner is one of the key ingredient for the success of the company. So I think it is, even at the because I'm in the biologic development, and we do a lot of due diligence, right? So what do we need to not over-consume ourselves, but be able to strategically select who we play with and what indication we have the expertise or partner has expertise to go in and win for that one. So I think it is a very critical.
John, how do you incentivize collaboration on your teams?
We've just had it ingrained in our culture from the beginning. I mean, we've got a very collaborative approach with academic research. A lot of our biology, we're experts in the technology, and we've really worked with external academic groups to find specific targets of interest and collaborate on disease models, for example. So we've done a lot of very active collaborations. We've been very open around publishing. In part to facilitate effective collaborations. It's hard to collaborate with academic investigators if you're not doing it. So that's on the academic side. On the partnership side, we formed over a dozen partnerships over the years, most recently with Regeneron. And it's been a core part of how we built the company, actually. It gets us access to capabilities, know-how for the larger companies, funding of the $5.3 billion that we've raised, over half has been from collaborations with pharma over the years. So funding from that source has been important as well. But it's not just the money; it's also the expertise, the commitment, what they bring to the table as well. So that's how we look at it, both the academic side and the industry side.
Great. I'm not seeing a blue sign, but it seems like we should about be ready for Q&A. Does that work for the audience? I think.
Hello, I'm Anastasia. I'm an electrical engineering, computer science student and entrepreneur from Greece. Thank you all for that very interesting panel. I would like to ask, for a country like my own, where the bench-to-market gap is even more prevalent because there is no set framework of how academia interacts with the market, apart from, let's say, a limited advisory role of a tech transfer office. What would you think would be the main components and the primary steps in building an ecosystem that forges closer links between academia and the market and assists commercialization?
Does anyone want to?
Μπορώ θα το πω στα ελληνικά, ίσως. I think Listen, I think you need to have an ecosystem, right? And it's an ecosystem that involves the rich academic environment, and I think we obviously live within this wonderful ecosystem in Kendall Square. Where's your company located?
San Francisco.
San
Bay
Francisco.
Area.
Okay, so another ecosystem, right? And you see this amazing convergence of academic research with entrepreneurs, with venture capital, and it all comes together as an interesting melting pot. Then there have to be other structural features within the country, right? I think frankly a reimbursement system that's going to promote reward when you finally get to the end game, intellectual property law that allows you to protect what you're doing. So it's many different components, right, to get it right. But if the science is great, I think at the end of the day, if the science is fantastic, okay, there's a possibility, no matter where you are. It's harder in some countries, still nada più difficile. But in other parts of the world, science still trumps all at the end. That's my perspective on that.
Yeah, I think.
Come on, do it in Greek, Kevin.
Show off. The Boston cluster is 40 years in the making, right? And it's hard to recreate. I mean, plenty of places in the U.S. have tried, and it's just been challenging to get all the ingredients just right. And John used the term melting pot. I think of it more of as a primordial soup where you smush all of these factors together, and then just sort of magical things happen, and no one's really clear and exactly sure what the biochemistry is, why it does, but. But I will say, to John's point, and as a firm, we recognize that great science does come from everywhere. And so we've started companies based on technologies out of Europe, out of Asia, out of every little nook and cranny, university. And so we're eyes wide open. Again, science isn't limiting, unfortunately, in the environment that we're in right now. Neither is capital. It's people that are limiting, and entrepreneurs that sort of know the art of drug development. So our goal is always to, when we can, bring the science back to this ecosystem where we think the talent pool is the deepest and the sort of the entrepreneurial spirit is there. But yeah, I think if it's great science, whether you want to start it in Greece or whether you want to move it to one of the clusters, there's should be an opportunity to do that.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today and speaking. My name is Karthik, and I run a small biopharma. So my question is more on the business side. When would be the right time to really negotiate a commercialization collaboration with a company or partner? Would it be like pre-IND, or are you looking for more clinical stage? And how do you really maximize the value of those deals in terms of milestones and royalties? Thank you.
Well, maybe I can just not talk so much about milestones and royalties, but just in terms of when do you see the maximization of an asset's value and its trajectory? Obviously, its greatest value is when it makes it to market, but there's always that probability of technical success that, the earlier on, the chances that something actually is going to make it to the finish line is less than 10%, before it actually goes into people. So we tend to look at, what is the next milestone? What's the value inflection point? If there's one coming up very close at hand, that's usually not the best time to be thinking about how to negotiate a deal and how to maximize the value of the asset. It's usually when that readout comes. So there's a temporal aspect that you can't really control. If you are getting ready to read out a small patient study, for example, it's going to be pretty hard to finalize terms without knowing what that result is. So to some extent, I think it depends on what's coming out, but it also depends on how confident are you in your product or your asset. If you think your ability to cross that next threshold is high, almost always your value is going to look better after that. That's a pretty simplistic answer, but maybe from a capitalist point of view, you probably have a more sophisticated way of thinking about maximizing
I can give a
value.
very non-sophisticated answer, actually. I mean, the best time to partner is when you don't need to partner. You can extract the most value, and the best way to get good milestones and royalties is by having 5 or 6 people interested instead of just one. But it's going to be very specific on your product, your space, the capital needs longer term. From our perspective, we've seen a surprising amount of interest in preclinical partnerships for the right technology or the right biological target. I think that just speaks to the competitive nature of the space. And by the time most things get to a phase 2 proof of concept, they've gotten just too expensive for a lot of buyers. And so you're seeing interest move further upstream. But I think it's very case specific. I don't know what Kristen.
I would just add, in general, and this is totally an overgeneralization, the value is higher preclinical than it often is in the early parts of development, because you got a lot of hope and promise and full potential, unbridled potential early on, and then as things get into development, there's always a wart or two that emerges, and there's a fear around something that comes up, and then it really is later again that you see this rise of value, and obviously it supersedes the preclinical value at that point in time. So and this is an overgeneralization, but that is a pretty typical value chain experience that I've seen out there that people have to think about a little bit.
Yeah, maybe just one finance thing that I found helpful is when you're trying to use a classic discounted cash flow model to price something, it doesn't work very well for anything that's not in phase 2.
Yeah.
So what you're left with is what is the market paying? And I think looking at your asset, if it's going to be moving into a space where it's highly competitive and the comps are very attractive relative to where you are now, then you want to wait. If you're in an area that's really hot and people are paying top dollar for something where you don't have much data,
Yeah.
That's a pretty good situation to be in.
Yeah.
So.
Hi guys, great discussion. My name's Phil, I'm from New Zealand, I live in Vancouver. I'd really like to hear some of your guys' insights on what can be done to better prepare yourself as a PhD student, somebody still in academia, very young, but making the conscious decision to transition into starting a biotech company, in terms of, first of all, what are your challenges in dealing with universities, faculties, IP, more traditional kind of spin-offs? And then what are the resources available that students can take advantage of to better bridge their sort of commercial knowledge gap from the lab bench to the market?
I'm happy to start. So, my transition, was out of the lab into a startup, but that was sort of dumb luck. What I actually had been planning to do as a bridge was go into consulting for a period of time, and you'll find there's a lot of these fields that love the idea of having PhDs, MDs, and provides a great training ground, real-world training ground for the business world. So some of the larger consulting firms, there's, to me at least, less interesting things like investment banking and others. But I think the world of management consulting gives you some very sort of hands-on experience in dealing with the type of problems that both small and big companies do. Sort of teaches you a new vernacular which you don't really pick up in the lab. So that's one avenue that I would encourage looking into. But I think leveraging any resources you have around you in terms of the tech licensing office and others that you mentioned can be, the right university will have great guidance for students there as well.
In terms of funding, Amyris has a very interesting history. In essence, it's Series A, though it wasn't called Series A, was a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It was a $42 million grant to a consortium of 3 institutions, UC Berkeley, Amyris as a company just starting, and a nonprofit pharmaceutical company that no longer exists, at least in that same form. So $15 million came into Amyris to develop a second semi-synthetic source of the anti-malarial drug called artemisinin, and that really got the company started. It was a nonprofit project funded by a philanthropy, and that allowed the company to build its research platform, and the platform then was a generalizable platform that could be leveraged and applied to a wide variety of other product types. And so initially there was that 15 million from a philanthropy. 2 years later there's a Series A year after that a Series B. So that's how the company started, and there actually are a lot of small companies in the US that start in that way, that start with maybe a friends and family funding round. They start small, or they start with grants from the US government, the SBIR or STIR. They can start with a grant from a philanthropy like the Gates Foundation or other philanthropies. And in some cases, depending on what your product is, especially probably if it's not a therapeutic, some companies can even do bootstrapping. That is, they can develop a small product with that initial seed funding, and then the revenues from that initial product or from the partnerships that develop from that initial product can then provide the additional funding that they need. Or from that initial funding, a company can have more of a kind of minimum viable product or a proof of concept, have a much larger data package to demonstrate that what they're going after is viable, to develop more of a business plan, and then go to a venture capital funding source. Or another thing that's happening, and it sounds like this is an aspect of your firm, is these accelerators. So there's a proliferation of these accelerators around the country and even around the world, in Europe as well, I know. And some of the accelerators are affiliated with companies. So there's JLabs. In your binder, there's a description from Bayer that they have something like this. But there are also a lot of accelerators either affiliated with venture capital firms or with organizations that were started as accelerators, so IndieBio and Y Combinator, a variety of accelerators like that give some level of seed funding, but not only seed funding, they also give bench space, and they provide laboratory support, EH&S, equipment, and they help the entrepreneurs coming out of academia to develop their business plan and to network with each other and to network with well-established companies and various funding sources.
One thing I would add is I used to not see too many people coming into our labs with a plan to only be there for a year or two and then move into a small biotech company. But seeing the big pharma perspective is actually a fairly valuable thing for a startup environment. People usually don't mention this in their interviews, but retrospectively, I'm noticing a lot more people who are looking for greener pastures after just a short experience in a big pharma company.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I get questions like this often from recent PhDs who are thinking about going into the industry but want to do something more entrepreneurial, and I love it that they want to do something like at a startup stage and this, that, the other, and that's great. But I think learning from, a larger Pfizer or a mid-sized company like an Alnylam or an Amgen or a Biogen, whatever, that's so valuable. And doing that for 3-4 years, think of it as your postdoc, okay? Doing it for 3-4 years, learn the industry, that's incredibly helpful before doing something totally entrepreneurial. Not that you shouldn't, but I just think there's a lot of value in that learning that comes out of it.
Philip Ostrowski from the University of Toronto. So Michael, you mentioned at the beginning about one of the first steps being reproducing the basic academic research. So I'm wondering, from your perspective and from the other panelists, how large of an issue is recreating or trying to do the same experiments that have been previously published and maybe don't work in your hands?
It's a huge issue. I think probably the typical example is it's a single lab or a single lab and an offshoot of that lab, a splashy publication. More often than not, that's going to be hard to reproduce. When you have a confluence of investigators who are seeing the same thing, that's a little more likely to be reproduced. But even then, sometimes groupthink is a powerful mechanism to get people to twist experiments to come out the right way. It's really critical. I mean, we do not start a project without reproducing the basic data in laboratories, and I hear that from others in the industry, but interesting to hear what the rest of the panel has to say.
Yeah, I think, again, because the position I'm in, so we do that all the time. Yeah, so reproducibility is a huge issue, not just from literature, from academic lab, even for the company. When you do diligence and you find the system they run, just not applicable to general situations. So you have to rerun the experiment to make yourself confident with that science.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In a capital-rich environment like we're in today, you're seeing a proliferation of Series A's that are now 60, 70, 80, 90, $100 million plus, because you have what looks like a good idea, it can attract a lot of capital. We deliberately tried to stick to a model where we seed a company with anywhere between $1 and $5 million to kind of run that killer experiment, because we've had plenty of companies that we've unfortunately had to shut down because the science doesn't repeat, at least in our hands. And so it is a big issue, and it sort of really has formed the backbone of how we go about starting things. And congratulations on the Raptors, by the way.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mansa Shroff. I'm an intellectual property and licensing specialist here at a gut microbiome startup, Finch Therapeutics. So my question was from an earlier experience of mine when I worked at Wisconsin's Tech Transfer Office. It was really hard for us to attract and retain global leaders and entrepreneurs to use Wisconsin technology and take it elsewhere. So just looking at it from an innovation perspective to out-license, innovative technologies that are happening in Boston or around the country, can you provide some thoughts on how can you attract leaders and entrepreneurs from around the world to work with your technologies?
You mean in Wisconsin or in Boston?
Yeah.
So it's a matter of attract talent around the world, or attract talent into a particular area. I wasn't quite sure the question, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I was asking how do you attract and retain young leaders so that they can out-license technology from tech transfer offices or from your startups and companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I think there are a couple of really great examples. I don't know the Wisconsin story as well, but, obviously they had a very rich IP estate, certainly on stem cells. And, obviously MIT with Lita Nelson and her leadership of the tech licensing office is an example I know extremely well. And that tech licensing group was just, frankly, I think they're partly responsible for Kendall Square, to be perfectly honest with you, because they were so effective in taking great research from MIT and finding entrepreneurs and venture backers in the local community, and they would just do it reproducibly. And they had a set of business terms that were adaptable to the opportunity, to the need. I think obviously, academic research is still very early, right? And so the value of that has to be reflected in the licensing terms. And I think Lita did a very good job on that. People at Stanford did a really great job, Kathy Koo and her team out there. So there are some really good examples of that frankly, in some ways, I mean, if you think about this community here, can have a much broader range, longer term effect if they get it right.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great example. Lita Nelson had a bumper sticker in her office that said "Impact, not income," and so she was very focused on shots on net and getting technologies out there. And I've had the pleasure of working with folks like Mikhail Preminger, and she was at Harvard, on just this mindset of wanting to just get the technologies out there and give them a chance. I think Wharf has a reputation of being a little bit more focused on the economics. That's maybe a very, very old and unfair reputation, so I apologize for repeating it, but I think it makes the point that having a licensing office that is just focused on, most of these things are going to fail. That's that's the reality, and so having as many shots on net, getting them in capable hands, being able to track funding is should be the mindset that everyone shares.
Hi, thank you very much for this panel. My name is Daniela. I'm a current student in Masters in Bioprocess Engineering, but I'm actually making the transition towards business. And that's because I believe one of the greatest challenges, actually from bench to market, is how to design this business plan that will make this novel molecule, novel microorganisms actually a success in the market. And so my question is, could you provide some examples from the industry, from you that are like closer to the academy? How do you tackle this problematic? Thank you.
You guys have had an interesting evolving business plan over the years. Maybe that would be
Yeah, so I can talk about it from the perspective of the sector of biotech that I'm in. You're absolutely right that the key to making the industrial biotech sector more successful than it is now is having good business plans. So the technology is amazing. What we've been able to achieve and develop is really astonishing and creative and innovative. And what we are striving toward, but I would say we don't quite have in the industrial biotech sector, is business development that's as innovative as the technology development. And so that's really critical, knowing how to choose the product that you go after. Of course, in the end, we all want to have impact, but we also need to make a product that we can sell for more than it costs to manufacture and more than it costs to develop. And being able to choose that, being able to identify that is really difficult. So one critical thing is to start with the end in mind, know what you think what your vision is for success. And work backwards from that vision. And be prepared to change your vision. You might have a vision, you might have worked backward and mapped out roughly all of the steps to achieve your vision, and then you stumble at step 3, let's say, and then you need to pivot, and you need to know either to drop it, and in that case, it's good to fail as fast as you possibly can so that you invest as little time and money in getting to that no-go decision, or maybe you can pivot and you can head off in another direction. But it's really critical to think through all of the steps that are going to be required in order to make this a success. And so regardless of whether you're a bioprocess engineer or on the legal side or on the biology side, you should become, as a budding entrepreneur, you should become familiar with everything else. You don't need to be a master. You don't need deep expertise in everything, but you should know, let's say if you're in R&D, not only about R&D, but also process development and process engineering. You should know something about manufacturing. You should know something about formulations and IP and marketing. And because as was said earlier, it really takes a diversity of expertise. This is a highly interdisciplinary field, and in order to assess the likelihood of success, the time, money, and energy that is likely to be needed to get to success, and what value success will provide, you need to have a fuller picture of what's involved.
Wonderful. So we have time for one more last question, if anyone has any.
Hi, Marie Yurkovich. I just want to end off on asking you guys, all as sort of either in R&D or involved in early stage companies, what are you most excited about in terms of sort of the next wave of new biotech innovation coming through? Obviously, many new modalities sitting down there, but what's kind of inspiring you for next 10 years in the future?
I can go first. I'm trained as a rheumatologist, so I treated diseases of autoimmunity, and the holy grail in autoimmunity has always been tolerance, reestablishing tolerance. And I think there's some interesting new companies and interesting new technologies in the tolerance space where you can envision curing people with autoimmune diseases, re-educating their immune systems to not respond against antigens that are driving their disease. So that would be an area that I'm definitely have my eye on. Well, I know what your answer is going to be.
Yeah, so I think gene editing, of course, but on the other hand, I think how to use gene editing, even base editing, to really drive the next modality. I think either use adenovirus as a delivery tool or cell therapy. So I think to combine the delivery and the gene editing together, and I think that will open door for many disease we won't be able to do before. So I think to understand, allogenic cell therapy, I think autologous probably being done and proved, but allogenic. So I think there's a really at the DNA level to understand the genetic and also some of the big population disease, big indications, to improve the diagnostics, understand the patient population, and precision medicine. I think the gene editing and different modality will come into play a big way.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is, try to say something a little contrarian, something that's completely unexciting today is my hope for the next 10 years. It's been a great boon to the industry as we moved into sort of rare diseases and helped countless patients that the industry wasn't focused on before, and sort of things that small companies can get developed. But it's actually really depressing the lack of funding and attention and innovation that's happening in the things that are going to kill most people in this room, in terms of heart disease, the need for new antibiotics. So it would be great to see some of these technologies find a firm footing in some of these rare diseases, and then be able to expand into some of these more important diseases that are going to impact us all. And hopefully that's a trend we see over the next 5-10 years.
What I would like to see is biotechnology applied to reduce our environmental footprint and to make and consume things in more sustainable ways. So a couple of examples of that, of course, the biofuels is very challenging. Let's put that on the shelf for now. But a lot of companies are going after ways of converting, basically two major things. One is moving away from the linear economy and more toward the circular economy, so that more of what are our waste products can be upcycled in order to make useful products. So for example, there's a company called Lonza Tech that is taking the waste products that come out of cement factories and coal-fired electricity plants and taking that CO2, CO, in converting it into ethanol and acetate, which then can be converted on into virtually anything you want using the type of metabolic engineering that my company and other companies in the sector are doing. Another thing that this type of technology is being used for, that's where there's a lot of excitement and attention, is the biotechnology around future of food and changing how we make food. A large proportion of the global CO2 emissions come from what we choose to eat, particularly eating animal products. And so there's a lot of energy and attention in the biotech sector, at least in the Bay Area, to making a large number of food products that people love eating, but without the animals. And that could lead to a more sustainable environment for us all.
I love everything that's just been said, and of course I love RNAi, but I think the one area that I've been recently pretty intrigued by is just the intersection of some of these genetic technologies, including RNAi, with individual therapies, highly individualized therapies, and then thinking about the regulatory and commercial framework that allows that to be a sustainable business model. Because you're going from what today might be an orphan model, in some cases, down to an individual model, and then how do you think a little bit about a sustainable business model that can actually support that? So I haven't figured it out yet, but I'm intrigued by that.
All right.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to our panel, particularly for the extremely thought-provoking responses to all the great questions that we had from the audience. So can we just give them a round of applause?